everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching all parts of Extra History series on Ibn Battuta. He is truly one of the great travelers of world history. He experienced and saw so much, and we get to see that through his eyes during this series. Some really fascinating stuff. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to exclusive content. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
June 23rd, 1325, Tangier. A 21-year-old scholar, mounted on a donkey, leaves home for the first time. His objective, the holy city of Mecca. He expects to be gone for 2 years, possibly even 3. I set out alone, he wrote later, having neither fellow traveler in whose companionship I might find cheer, nor caravan whose part I might join, but swayed by an overmastering impulse within me, and a desire long cherished in my bosom, to visit these illustrious sanctuaries. So I braced my resolution to quit my dear ones, female and male, and forsook my home as birds forsake their nests.
Alright, so pilgrimage to Mecca, pretty popular. A relatively long trip, but not sort of unimaginably long.
And he will not return home for another 24 years.
Whoa! Holy! Now that's a long trip. God damn.
When Ibn Battuta left Tangier, he had no idea that he was commencing on a journey so epic, we'd still be talking about it 700 years later.
Yeah.
And in his quarter century of wandering, he would end up seeing nearly the entire Muslim world of the 14th century.
Wow.
From the deserts of the Empire of Mali to the Islamic outposts of Indonesia and southern China.
Yeah, Indonesia and southern China, that is especially impressive. That is incredibly far afield from his starting point.
In doing so, he would travel around 75,000 miles, enough to circle the globe 3 times,
Damn.
meet 60 heads of state, and visit 40 modern countries. He would survive kidnapping and shipwreck, witness revolts and military campaigns, be imprisoned by a mad sultan, and encounter the horrors of the Black Plague.
Ooh.
And when he finally returned, the ruler of Morocco asked him to spend 2 years dictating all he saw to a literary scholar. The resulting book, a gift to those who contemplate the wonders of cities and the marvels of traveling, a title often shortened to The Travels, is 1,000 pages long, which is...
Love that. Love that we based a text on his travels. He came back. It's like, hey man, why don't you write down everything that you've seen? Because this absolutely seems like the kind of guy, you know, you learn about him, you're going to learn a lot about the world of the 1300s, the different places, the politics, the events, right through his life. You can learn a lot, you know, very wide and far.
Is sort of a problem if, for example, you're adapting it into a series of 5 short animated videos.
Right.
But in truth, even if we had 10 times the budget and development time for this series, we still wouldn't be able to do all of Ibn Battuta's travels justice. But what we can do, though, is look at the travels the way historians do today, as a way of understanding the breadth of Islamic religion and culture during the 14th century, how faith was adapted to local conditions, and the trade and travel links that could take a man from North Africa to China.
Yeah, I mean, he essentially explores almost the entire Muslim world. So, you know, a good way to understand what are the differences among the peoples of that world. How did they act similarly? How did they practice religion differently? What sort of societal and cultural differences can you find, right? Because this is spanning a massive amount of territory, a lot of different peoples and ethnicities and different continents, right? There's a whole lot to see, so you can certainly learn a lot through examining Ibn Battuta's journeys here.
And of course, we'll look at the curious, intrepid, ambitious, and often quite prickly man who experienced it all.
Okay.
Apart from what we learned from the travels, we actually know surprisingly little about Ibn Battuta himself. But we can be sure his formative years in Morocco were the perfect training for a great traveler. Tangier was not one of North Africa's great cities, but it was a massive trade hub. To the north lay Europe. To the south, the golden kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa. To the east lay the Mediterranean trade networks, and to the west, the burgeoning Atlantic trade. And its docks thronged with both Muslims and Christians, along with merchants from Africa, Europe, and the Middle East.
Right, you know, you're in North Africa and the Mediterranean. More generally, this has always been sort of a central location between Europe, Africa, and Asia. There's always been a lot of trade going between all these 3 continents, right? So you're seeing some very cosmopolitan places, lots of different peoples coming together with different languages, religions, cultures, right? So you're bound to meet a lot of different people there, and that'll definitely train you to travel wide and far.
Ibn Battuta's family were scholars of Islamic law and gave their son an education that would let him follow in the family tradition. This education made him a qadi, a magistrate or judge of Islamic law. Not only an honorable profession, but one, it turned out, that would let him find work wherever there was a Muslim community.
Right.
His education also likely instilled the curiosity that would drive him on his great journey. For in Islam, curiosity and the seeking of knowledge is considered a religious duty. In fact, a common saying at the time, seek knowledge even unto China, would really end up becoming quite literal for this young man.
Right. And you can see this with a lot of religions, but Islam in particular does have a special interest in scholarship and learning and academia. There's a really strong intellectual tradition within Islam, of course, both related to sort of religious scholarship, but also more secular scholarship, right? So that's a real tradition that I imagine we'll see come into play here.
But Ibn Battuta's travel experience began by embarking on the Hajj, or annual pilgrimage to Mecca, a religious duty for all Muslim men, if they had the resources, were healthy enough to do it, and their leaving wouldn't place a burden on their family. He set out alone at first, traveling east across North Africa, but soon joined up with a pilgrim caravan for protection against bandits. And they were happy to have him, as having a qadi among a caravan meant that disputes and matters of religious law could be solved without stopping the train. So they crossed the land.
I will say, just thinking about it, this is also, I think, a real interesting time to be exploring the Islamic world, the 14th century. You're in an era where Islam has spread really wide and far, and it's become sort of less unified. A lot of different states and peoples and ethnicities, like I said before, spread wide and far, right? So there's a lot to see, a lot of different people to see, a lot of these very prominent cities throughout the Islamic world, a lot of prominent scholarship and learning, and there's a lot to see. Basically, this is a very interesting time to explore those sort of regions of the earth.
And of the slave sultans, the Mamluks, who had risen from being enslaved soldiers to taking over the state. And though he was not far from home, Ibn Battuta began to reveal what he would be like as a traveler. A fever hit him hard, the first of many on his journey. Soon, he was so ill he could barely stay on his mount. "If God decrees my death," he said, "then my death shall be on the road, with my face set toward Mecca." Determined not to stop, he tied himself to his saddle in order to keep going. But stop he did. And during that brief sojourn, he did a very Ibn Battuta thing. While recovering, he fell in love and formed a marriage contract, but then dissolved it before the ceremony after a dispute with the woman's father. But then shortly afterward, he would meet and marry another woman, the first of 10. Oh, yeah, that's right. He would marry 10 women on
Okay, we've got ourselves a bit of a playboy.
his journey. Now, we don't know much
He's got girls in different area code. He's that kind of guy.
about these marriages. He simply mentions them in passing, confirming the Islamic literary convention of keeping his private life private. And often, like with his first wife, he would divorce his wives when he moved on. A common practice in medieval Islam, and perhaps these divorces may even have been mutually agreed,
Okay.
since religious law made that the easiest route to ending a marriage. But here is where we get the first hint of Ibn Battuta's lifelong fascination with women. Wherever he went, along with descriptions of food, agriculture, religious life, and court processions, he often remarked on how attractive he found the local ladies.
Damn, okay, bro. Relax. So my man's traveling around the world, writing about the different courts he's seeing, the architecture, the food, and also adding in, now let me describe the women of this country in particular. All right.
He was also known to have innumerable lovers and concubines over his life, including several that were enslaved.
Ooh.
And it's also at this point we get an early indicator of his, well, let's just call it snippy nature.
Right.
On a stop in Egypt, he visited the town bathhouse and was shocked to find the men inside were not wearing the hip coverings required by law. Basically, they were naked in the locker room. But now here's the thing about Ibn Battuta. He could get a bit judgy. And if he saw you doing something he considered wrong, oh, he was definitely telling the teacher. In fact, historians often refer to him as a busybody, for being all up in your business. But to put it in a more modern vernacular, Ibn Battuta was a total narc.
Oh.
So instead of just telling those guys to please cover up, he went straight to the local governor and started an official crackdown on proper dress in the bathhouses. Yeah, the phrase "that escalated quickly" was kind of his brand. But while he often comes off
Okay, so we've got a very driven, curious, womanizing narc who's traveling around the Islamic world. What an interesting character.
as judgmental, his job was to be a judge. And this trip across North Africa offered him the
True.
opportunity to develop those skills. Because while he
Very true. I guess if anyone should be judgmental, it would be a judge, especially a sort of religious judge. I guess he's got morals on the mind. Well, sometimes, maybe not other times, it seems like.
was fully qualified as a Qadi, the universities of Tangier were provincial when compared to those in Cairo, Damascus, and Alexandria.
This is sort of what I was getting at earlier with this era of Islamic history. You know, you've got some real centers of learning and education and scholarship. Like I said, that was a real tradition within Islam. And especially at this point during the Middle Ages, you've got a lot of prosperity and education in some of these really great cities to see.
So as he made his way toward Mecca, he would stop to study for a few months under great teachers, gaining further certifications. He saw the great lighthouse of Alexandria, visited Cairo, which he called the mother of cities, passed by the Giza pyramids, and traveled down the Nile, but then was halted by a violent revolt. So he doubled back to Cairo and instead took the royal road to Damascus. Diverting for a moment to visit the tomb of Abraham, then the Muslim sites in Jerusalem, he finally made it to the Mamluk's second capital. But eager to move on, he only spent 24 days in Damascus, probably living in the dormitory of the Great Mosque. Though he did pack that 3 weeks full, managing to survive another illness, gaining further certifications.
Yeah, I gotta say, if you're a great traveler of this era, or frankly, throughout most of history, one of the things you need to have is a very hardy immune system, right? You're probably going to be getting sick pretty frequently. You need to be able to fight off those diseases, right?
And celebrating Ramadan. Oh, and of course, he got married and divorced again.
In that span of time? God damn.
That's right, Zoe, because Ibn Battuta. And there he finally joined the official route of the Hajj, across a perilous desert route, haunted by epidemic disease, burning days, and freezing nights. And this time, Mamluk soldiers guarded them from bandits. Yet the caravan made it to its destination without incident, the city of Medina, where the Prophet Muhammad had retreated with his followers when driven out of Mecca. While there, he prayed at the Mosque of the Prophet, built over Muhammad's tomb, before continuing on. Then finally, upon reaching the holy city of Mecca, he took part in the rituals of the Hajj, making several circles around the Kaaba, bowing to the shrine of Abraham's footprints, standing on the plains before the Mount of Mercy, where the Prophet gave his farewell sermon, reciting prayers, and listening to religious teachings for a full day.
And this was sort of supposed to be, well, the end of his journey, essentially, right? He was going on a pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, right? So for most people, this is where they'd be done and they'd go back home. But for Ibn Battuta, right, his story is not nearly done here. He's got a lot more traveling and exploring to do. He said, you know what? I had a pretty good time going on this pilgrimage. What if I just explored everything?
And of course, he studied, seeking always more knowledge. For this pilgrimage had merely whetted his appetite for seeing the world.
Right.
Not to mention he had come across news that the Sultan of Delhi, immensely rich and generous, was in need of officials with proper certifications, which is why he was building his resume.
Yeah, seems like his training as a Qadi and some of these certifications and resume builders he's picking up are really going to benefit him going through all these countries. Can sort of show up, be like, hey, here's my qualifications. You can use me to do something, right? You've got to have some work for me.
Fame, fortune, and adventure awaited in the East, and he decided to extend this 18-month trip a little bit longer.
A little bit.
So Ibn Battuta turned his mount towards the lands of Muslim Persia and the devastated city of Baghdad.
Extend his journey a little bit longer. Not as if he had about 2 decades left of travel to do. All right, then. That is the beginning of the great travels.
November 1326, Iraq, Il-Khanate. Ibn Battuta sits, waiting for the ritual to begin. At the appointed hour come the Sufi mystics. When the afternoon prayers had been said, drums were beaten, and the brethren began to dance, he wrote. They had prepared loads of firewood, which they kindled into flame, and went into the midst of it dancing.
Oh.
Some of them rolled in the fire, others ate it in their mouths,
Damn.
until they finally extinguished it entirely. Some of them will take a large snake and bite its head with their teeth until they bit it clean through.
What the?
This is Islam as Ibn Battuta has never seen it, and it will
Right.
make a lasting impression.
Yeah, we talked about this last time, how Ibn Battuta essentially travels around almost the entire Muslim world of this era. And through doing that, he gets a good look at how is Islam practiced differently. Right? He sees the different cultures and peoples throughout this very wide span of territory. Right? And he'll probably see practices that he is altogether unfamiliar with, especially when he gets further and further afield from his home.
When Ibn Battuta was in Egypt, two separate holy men prophesied that he would travel far to the east and settle in India. And that made a certain amount of sense. The Sultan of Delhi was actively searching for scholars and judges to fill his bureaucracy, and paying them handsomely. So, when Ibn Battuta
Right, so maybe they weren't telling an incredible prophecy. Maybe they'd just been reading the news. And they're like, you'll probably get to head east and find a job. And he's like, well, that sounds pretty reasonable, actually.
got done with his pilgrimage to Mecca, he decided to just keep going. Because not only was he seeing the world, he was making a profit doing it.
Right.
You see, on his journey, he'd found that rulers often gave pilgrims lavish gifts, and a young Qadi got even more spectacular rewards. He'd heard that the further he got from the Islamic core of the Arabian Peninsula, the more generously a young scholar would be rewarded. Therefore, he made a vow to
Yeah, I
keep
mean, maybe he'd find his services more in demand the further afield he went. It's also interesting to see that instead of going home, he sort of continues his journey. Now, that might be because the further he travels, the longer it will take to get home. And so, sort of, the further you go, the more discouraged you are. It's like, well, I could take a quick trip home, but at this point, it's going to take me so long to get back, I might as well just continue my travels a little bit further. And you can see how that can continue to extend and extend and extend.
traveling, to see as much of the world as possible, and to never take the same route if he could avoid it. His eventual goal was India, but he might as well have some fun and make some money on his way there.
Right.
After all, he might spend the rest of his life in India and never get another chance to see this part of the world. So he began his gap year of travel, joining a Persian caravan and crossing out of Mamluk territory, trekking for 44 days into Mesopotamia, into the land of the Khans. A century before, the Mongols had swept into Persia and Iraq, devastating what were, until then, some of the most impressive and advanced cities of the Islamic world. And when Genghis Khan died, his empire split among his 4 descendants, leaving Persia under a Mongol.
And I like that they pointed out it was not really that simple. It was certainly a whole lot more complex, but we are covering a massive swath of history in a very small period of time here, so there's only so much you can do. You know, we're essentially saying the Mongols, here's what they did. Leave it at that, because we are seeing sort of the existing parts of that when Ibn Battuta arrives.
Ruler.
Or the remaining
But in
parts.
the century since then, the Mongols had converted to Islam and were now patrons of religion and learning. Still, as Ibn Battuta passed through the once mighty city of Baghdad and ruined sites formerly renowned for beauty and scholarship, he reflected on the passing of empire.
Right. Ibn Battuta has and will see some great Islamic cities throughout his journeys, filled with prosperity and trade and education, but Baghdad, he sort of missed its golden age, where it was truly one of, if not the greatest city in the world for all of those things.
And he began to realize another thing. He was now truly abroad. His previous travels had taken him to new places, but this was different. As he left the Arabian Peninsula, he ventured into lands that were still religiously Muslim, but had underlying cultures increasingly divergent from his own.
Right.
Many of the rulers and court figures out here, the people he associated with most, were relatively new converts, second and third generation Muslims, some even first. And their practices at times varied from what Ibn Battuta considered the norm.
Right, well, when you see these religions that spread wide and far, whether we talk about Islam or Christianity or whatever, Buddhism, any of these types of very popular religions, what you'll find is that, one of the reasons why they're popular and why they're so widespread is that as they expand, locals in certain regions, well, they will embrace those religions, but while embracing them, they'll sort of adopt them into their own cultures and practices. They will take their pre-existing cultural practices
and usually even their pre-existing religious practices, and they'll merge them with, once again, Islam or Christianity or whatever we're talking about. And so, while you're fine, yes, these people are united under the banner of Islam, they'll have a lot of practices that may have come from their culture or their ethnic group or their previous religions or whatever that they have sort of brought into their practice of Islam. And that's why you'll find a lot of different practices, if you go wide and far around the world.
He was about to see Islam in all of its many forms, and that exploration began during his first encounter with Sufi mysticism, a sect that used trance, ritual movement, and chanting as a way to experience God's love on an emotional level, rather than the intellectual manner in which Ibn Battuta was accustomed. The same year, he got to meet the Khan himself, joining the royal caravan, traveling along the Silk Road to see the capital of Khanate. On the way, he visited with the Great Khan, seeing firsthand how the Mongol invaders had become assimilated into Persian culture.
Yeah, and this is often what happens with these types of invaders. I mean, if your idea is to invade, conquer, and rule, which is often the idea, I mean, the Mongols start as a more nomadic people, but as they expand and build their empire, they start to settle down, become more sedentary, and rule these places. And oftentimes, when that happens, of course, they'll bring a lot of aspects of their culture, but you're also going to end up absorbing a lot of the culture and practices of the area in which you're ruling. We see this process time and time again.
Far from a fierce steppe raider, this Khan was a just ruler, a handsome, observant Muslim who played the lute and composed poems in both Persian and Arabic. His kingdom was mighty and powerful. Ibn Battuta did not know it then, but when he next passed through 11 years later, the mighty Ilkhanate would be no more.
Yeah, I was going to say mighty and powerful, for not much longer.
Its ravaged landscape filled with warfare and death. But that's in the future. Now, he bade the Sultan farewell and reached the Khan's capital, exploring its enclaves of Venetian, Genoese, Arab, and Chinese merchants before touring the Euphrates and then heading back to Baghdad. But it was time to get on to India. His gap year of religious tourism was coming to an end. But first, a side trip back to Mecca to make the Hajj pilgrimage again.
Okay.
Because who knew if he'd ever get another chance? Yet that took longer than expected. He'd overextended himself a bit. In 1 year, Ibn Battuta had traveled 4,000 miles.
Wow.
And when he finally arrived back in Mecca, he was so exhausted and ill that after the Hajj, he took a full year to study, pray, and recover. But after that, it was off to Delhi. He went south to the Red Sea, traveling by ship until he was blown off course and became too seasick, so he had to continue his travels on land.
I like this journey where he's aiming for India, but just keeps getting sidetracked a little bit. Well, I had to go back to Mecca. Well, I had to go here. I had to stay here for a little bit. It's like, okay, well, he's seeing a lot more while he makes this sort of extended journey to India.
Across the mountains of Yemen. But eventually, he made it to southern Arabia, where Muslim ports controlled the Indian Ocean trade, where he could get on another ship to India and settle down at a real job. But first, a side trip. I mean, because Africa was right there.
Right.
And look, he might never get back this way again. So he jumped on a ship and went on a port hopping tour.
Yeah, I can see why this guy was traveling for more than 20 years now.
Of East.
He's like me playing Skyrim, where you've got your one main quest in front of you, but, you've got side quests you want to do along the way. And, you've found this cool landmark. Well, I got to check this out, right?
Africa, visiting the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, as well as the Muslim courts of Mogadishu, Mombasa, and Zanzibar. There, he saw how Muslim merchants had settled into the ports, converting locals and intermarrying into African families. Their languages blend.
Yeah, once again, we're seeing a blend of different cultures, religions, and practices as these Muslim merchants settle in the area, intermingle with the local populations. You see conversions happening. You see local cultural practice getting mixed in, right? So you see, once again, a mixing and adoption of different cultures.
Blending to create what we now know as Swahili. He saw the
this is what happens when you have a very cosmopolitan world, especially revolving around trade. I think people often get the wrong idea when we talk about, say, the Middle Ages, right? We're in the mid-14th century here, that it was a very sort of static place. Everything was in one way or another sort of divided off, right? We talk about the world today and how it's so globalized, which is true, but that doesn't mean that the world of the past was not globalized or interconnected. Sure, less so than today. I mean, the interconnection now is at an all-time peak, but you'd always see different cosmopolitan interconnected communities throughout history, right? We see a lot of this.
African families, their languages blending to create what we now know as Swahili. He saw the African section of the vast Indian Ocean trade, with merchants loading vast quantities of gold, ivory, spices, and perfume ingredients into their triangle-rigged ships, along with enslaved Africans captured from kingdoms further inland. And in these port towns,
And we see the slave trade practiced at this time, right? And if you keep in mind, we're in the mid 1300s, especially as we head into the 1400s, a lot of Europeans will begin to pick up on this African slave trade. And then, of course, as we move into the 1500s, as a lot of these European powers begin to conquer territory in the Americas, then the African slave trade is really going to ramp up as the demand ramps up, right? As these European empires bring a lot of these slaves across the Atlantic Ocean, right? But you see the practice pre-existing here, and this is sort of what those European powers begin to tap into when we really see the Atlantic slave trade kicking off.
Ibn Battuta first saw
Of course,
society.
this is on the other side of the continent, but they are drawing enslaved people from sort of further inland, right? We're not necessarily talking about the same trade here, right? The two opposite sides of Africa. Keep that in mind. But you do see this sorts of slave trading practices, of course, not just in Africa, but much further afield in Europe, in the Caucasus, in the Middle East. Right? This was not an uncommon trend at that time.
Societies where Muslims were the minority, where the elites and rulers didn't share a religious tie to the majority of their population.
Right.
But these were no frontier ports. They were cities whose rulers lived in palaces with indoor plumbing. Elites dressed in silk and ate off porcelain, both imports from China. He saw great mosques and mansions carved from coral. Mixed cultures formed from Islam's economic dominance of the maritime networks.
Right, and I don't want to generalize, but you do see a little bit of this. I talked about the sort of intermingling, but sometimes in these types of situations, especially where you see sort of Arabic Muslim merchants settling along the coast, some of these communities are very intermingled, but you can get situations where essentially your sort of elite, particularly economic elite, but also political elite, are made up of these, Muslim Arabic traders, whereas the rest of your population may be more local to the area and may practice different types of religions, right? So you can see sometimes a disconnect between the average person there and this elite sort of trading class, the merchant class.
But again, his time was running short, the monsoon winds changing and blowing back north. So he hopped on a ship back to the Arabian Peninsula, where he could finally travel on to India. But when he arrived on the southern coast of Arabia, he realized it would be cool to see the Gulf of Oman. Though that was a bit of a disaster. Their guide tried to rob and murder him, and Ibn Battuta only escaped after fending the man off with a spear.
Whoa.
He reached the Gulf dehydrated, half dead from illness, and feet bleeding from the trip. It was a close call, and probably an indication that now it was really time to head to Delhi.
Sure.
Become established. But first, a side trip. Back to Mecca for the Hajj for a third time.
Damn.
After another year of study and rest, Ibn Battuta was finally ready for India. For real this time. He'd buffed his resume with qualifications, could tell stories of far-flung places, and had built up a tidy profit in gifts. But the trip itself would be treacherous. And to get there, he needed a guide. And he couldn't find one.
Oh.
Okay, no problem. Because everyone knew that the Turkish Silk Road caravans linked Anatolia with India. And if you joined them, you'd get there eventually. Sure, there were more direct routes, but he'd seen that stuff already. He went to Cairo and met up with a traveling buddy. And reunited, the two stepped onto a Genoese galley and made for Anatolia. And in this land, whose urban centers...
Wow, he's going a little further north than I expected. You keep thinking, oh, he's gonna head east now. No, he's heading south and back to Mecca, now north, up into Anatolia on a Genoese galley.
Contained neighborhoods of minority Christians, Jews, and Greeks, and where nomadic herders traveled the wild hillsides, they gave him a warm welcome. This country is one of the finest in the world, he wrote. In it, God has brought together the good things dispersed throughout other lands. Its people are the most comely of men, the cleanest in their dress, the most delicious in their food, and the kindliest folk in creation.
Wow, he was a big fan of Anatolia. Shout out.
Wherever we stopped in this land, whether it a hospice or a private house, our neighbors came to ask after our needs. When we left, they bade us farewell as though they were our relatives. He also saw one city execute people by firing them off a cliff with a catapult, but overall, the people were really nice. Interestingly, he found differences in their religious practice. Though observant Muslims, they chewed intoxicating drugs and did not veil women. In fact, Turkish society surprised him when he found out how high a status women had.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, you see different practices of Islam throughout the world. I think even today you'll find, because we're talking about Anatolia, that today would be Turkey, you'll find that in terms of orthodox adherence to Islam, that's not really how Turkey does it. You know what I mean? They're a little more, you could say, loose and casual with their practice.
Now further weighed down with Turkish gifts, he pushed north toward the Silk Road, down the rapids of swollen rivers, nearly freezing to death in the wilderness, avoiding bandits and thieves. But he made it to the Black Sea and boarded a ship for an even stranger place, one of nomads and horsemen, the land of the Golden Horde.
Ooh.
But first, a side trip.
Of course, more side trips. We're getting some more Mongol influence there. That's always interesting. He's done some ship travel, I will point out, but mostly overland, primarily an overland traveler. So I guess we'll see how that evolves as we go throughout the series. Well, there you go. Another interesting part of Extra History's Ibn Battuta series.
May 1332, the Caucasus.
Mm.
Ibn Battuta and his wagon train have pitched their tents on a hill, waiting to see sight of the royal caravan they wish to join. His train full of servants, enslaved people, and concubines has been waiting a long time. Then, dust on the horizon. We saw a vast city on the move, he wrote, with its inhabitants, with mosques and bazaars in it. The smokes of the kitchens.
A vast city on the move. Now, that's often how the Mongols in particular are described, right? These sort of nomadic societies, cities on the move, all these different people, all these different aspects of life being moved from one place to another, right? A nomadic style of life versus a more sedentary style of life.
Rising in the air, for they cook while they march, and horse-drawn wagons transporting the people. He descends to meet Ozbeg Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde.
Russian shoulders with some important guys.
When Ibn Battuta crossed the Black Sea and landed in Crimea, he'd soon realized he'd crossed into another world. Though the Khanate's state religion was Islam, the more European provinces of the empire were thoroughly Christian.
Yeah, and Islam had only relatively recently become the state religion. Now, there was a certain degree of Islamicization among the population, but especially considering the fact that the Mongols had come in, conquered, and now were ruling over a bunch of different populations, you would find a variety of different peoples and religions. Like they said, in the sort of more Eastern European, Russian side of things, you have a lot of Christians, Orthodox Christians in particular.
Filled with Russians and Ukrainians. And that meant red-haired people with blue eyes, who ate pork and made evil noises by ringing their church bells. A sound that terrified Ibn Battuta.
Oh, yeah?
But he soon passed out of the infidel lands and entered the steppe, traveling for the first time by wagon rather than horse or camelback.
That's interesting because he's mostly been in majority Muslim areas. Some places where there was more a mix of religions, but I think that's the first time he's been in sort of a majority Christian region or area. He went to East Africa where there was a mix of Islam and non-Islamic religions. He saw Anatolia where there was a mix of Muslims and Christians and Jews, though, still under Muslim rule. Here, you saw actual sort of Orthodox Christian majority populations. Interesting.
Joining a Mongol caravan in order to find the Khan and link up with the Silk Road to India. And he found much to like about the hardy and competent Mongols, but also much that shocked him. Even the observant Muslims drank alcohol, for instance, arguing that the Quran forbade wine and wheat beer, but not millet beer or fermented mare's milk. Ah, sweet, delicious loopholes. These differences came into stark relief when he met Ozbeg Khan, entering his huge gold-tiled tent and finding the ruler sitting on a silver throne, flanked by 4 unveiled wives. In fact, he was soon to learn that the Khan consulted his wives on matters of state, in public, and that upon entering a tent, it was the Khan that stood until his wives were seated. Mongol society often treated women as near equals, and powerful women held a position higher than less powerful men.
Yeah, like I said, he's seeing how different people live their lives, practice their religion, even if they share a religion. Islam, he's seeing how they interpret it differently. I mean, he was in Anatolia last episode. He found that they practiced their religion quite differently, maybe did not observe in quite an orthodox manner as he'd seen elsewhere. Now he's seeing an even further sort of different and loose interpretation of it, right? A different culture, different ways of life.
This was very different from his native Morocco, where a leader's wives might privately wield influence, but were never seen in public. Ibn Battuta spent Ramadan with the Khan, visiting and conversing with his wives, and becoming particularly close with the youngest, Princess Bayalan, whom he shared much in common. For she too was far from home and adrift in a strange culture,
Hmm.
the daughter of the Byzantine emperor,
Huh.
given away in a political marriage. Ibn Battuta sympathized, but for different reasons. While he liked the Khan, who was a generous and able ruler, he disliked how the man drank, even showing up for afternoon prayer one day, stumbling drunk and nearly
Uh-oh.
incomprehensible.
I mean, there's different interpretations of religion. That might take it a little far, especially for a more orthodox Muslim, a more stringent believer in the faith. That's a little disrespectful.
But as a point of etiquette, after all of the gifts and hospitality the Khan had bestowed upon him, he really couldn't just drop the mic and bail on his latest patron. So instead, he asked the Khan if he could take, you guessed it, a side trip. Because Princess Bayalan was pregnant and got permission to have their baby at home in Constantinople.
Wow,
So, Ibn Battuta requested
that's quite a side trip.
to accompany her, as it was the perfect opportunity to take said side trip, not just in safety, but in style.
Right.
The request granted, Ibn Battuta set out with the princess's caravan, doubling back
Traveling with the princess to Constantinople, yeah, that is traveling in style.
to the city of the Byzantines, seeing the Hagia Sophia and meeting the emperor, marveling at the
Hey.
city's relative religious tolerance, and touring the Golden Horn. But there was a bit
Talking about majority Orthodox populations, he's now in Constantinople, the city of Orthodox Christianity. This is now, well, I can't really plot it geographically, but the sort of furthest, maybe afield culturally or religiously from where he started.
of a problem. See, on the way back home, Princess Bayalan had started throwing off the facade of Islamic conversion, and now it was clear
Ah.
that she wasn't coming home. This had been an escape
Oh.
plan, so Ibn Battuta had to turn around with the royal caravan, retrace his steps, and inform the Khan. Except now,
Yeah, we have learned he's a bit of a narc. Though, that's more than just being a narc. That's a pretty big deal. He's like, uh-oh, the princess is not going back. She wants to stay home in Constantinople. Now I have to go and find the Khan again. Oh,
was winter on the steppe, and Ibn Battuta, a Moroccan, was not used to snow.
right.
It was so cold that they traveled along frozen rivers as if they were roads. So cold that when he washed his face with hot water, it froze in his beard. So
Damn.
cold that he wore 3 fur coats and so many layers of clothing underneath that he had to be helped into the saddle. But they made it to the capital of the Khanate, and after presumably telling the Khan about his wife, because he never actually mentions the reaction, Ibn Battuta joined the trade caravan
Yeah, I imagine the reaction was not incredibly pleasant. But who knows?
toward India. And this was some of the hardest traveling of his career, through mountains and dry country, and his recollections of it are confused and non-specific. In 8 months of relentless travel, he met the Khan of Chagatai, had a daughter, and finally
What?
crossed through the Khyber Pass
Huh?
into India. They had to spread blankets in front of the camels so their feet would not sink in the deep snow. The Indian border authorities met him as he crossed into India, questioning him about his intentions and qualifications, and telling him that should he wish to work for the Sultan, he must agree never to leave India except on official business.
Whoa.
He agreed and signed a contract. Then,
That's quite the contract to sign. I will say, I do not believe he's going to hold to that word. This is a man who cannot help but travel in just about every direction. There's no shot he's going to be held down.
he took out a loan to buy the Sultan an appropriate gift of horses, gold, and enslaved people, knowing the custom was to be granted an even larger gift in return. Yeah, he hadn't gone gold digging across 3 continents without learning how this stuff worked. When the party arrived, Ibn Battuta was overawed. The Sultan's wooden palace, known as the Hall of 1,000 Pillars, was one of the largest structures he'd ever seen. Could it be that the rumors of the Sultan's splendor and generosity were not an exaggeration? Well, unfortunately, it would be a while before Ibn Battuta found out. because Muhammad Tughlaq, the Sultan of Delhi, was out crushing a rebellion. But in his absence, the Sultan's vizier accepted the gift and gave Ibn Battuta silk robes, a house, the tax revenue of 2 villages,
Whoa.
which is 5,000 silver dinars a year for those of you keeping score at home, plus another 2,000 dinars as a starting bonus. Ibn Battuta was floored.
Not bad. I mean, we said this in previous episodes, but his sort of expertise as a Qadi, an Islamic judge, he was doing pretty well for himself, but the further afield he goes, the more money he makes for his services, especially being such a well-traveled individual with such a resume to draw on. He's got, quite the achievements to boast of already. Like I said, quite the good resume to present.
He was already part of Delhi's landed aristocracy, and he hadn't even been given a job yet.
Nice.
Then, things got even wilder, because the Sultan returned to Delhi in triumph, riding to the palace on a war elephant, the first in a great procession of armored beasts. And on the back of each elephant was a huge basket of treasure and a catapult. Entranced, Ibn Battuta watched his men shoveled gold and silver coins into the machines and fired the treasure out into the celebrating crowd.
Wow.
And that's when it hit Ibn Battuta. This was a dream job. Coming here was a great idea. And this was only reinforced when he met the Sultan. And Muhammad Tughlaq liked the Moroccans so much that he made Ibn Battuta the Qadi of Delhi. And at this point, even Ibn Battuta was like, thank you? But maybe that's too much. I mean, except for being a Qadi on a caravan, I never had a real job or tried a case. In fact,
he's like, I do have quite the resume. I've met a lot of important people, done some pretty cool stuff. But in terms of my job experience, it's not actually too extensive. I mean, I wouldn't turn down this sort of opportunity, but I guess our good friend Ibn Battuta here feels that maybe he should take a little step back.
Your religious law here is a bit different than the type I studied. Not to mention your court language is Persian, which I don't really speak well, so maybe we just let me work my way up? Huh? The Sultan told him not to worry, assigned 2 deputies to do the real work, and doubled his salary.
Classic.
Unusual? Undoubtedly. But Ibn Battuta was about to find out that
Man, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. He's like, you're not ready to do the job? That's fine. Just assign him some assistants and pay him even more. I like the guy. This is classic sort of absolute ruler type stuff.
the Sultan of Delhi was a bit of an eccentric. An unorthodox visionary. Some referred to him as mad.
Oh.
Early in his reign, he'd experimented with issuing copper coins backed by gold, but that scheme fell apart when Chinese traders wouldn't accept them. Then, he decided to found a new capital and move his court to central India. And when the elites resisted, he used troops to force them. That too collapsed. And now, fear.
Hey, you need to be a pretty powerful ruler to move all your elites to the middle of nowhere. Or not the middle of nowhere, but just away from where they are. You can look at Louis XIV, the Sun King, or Peter the Great in Russia. 2 monarchs, 2 absolute monarchs, very powerful rulers who said to their aristocrats, you know what? You're coming with me. Come on now, move. And they moved.
Fearing the entrenched power blocks of the elites that hated him. The Sultan was hiring any foreigners that showed up so that they would be personally loyal to him, which was good, at least for Ibn Battuta. He became close with the Sultan, observing as the monarch a religious scholar in his own right, invited Hindu and Jain holy men into the palace for religious debates. He even accompanied the monarch on military campaigns. At one point, the Sultan brought Ibn Battuta to see the Hindu yogis perform tricks, like climbing a levitated rope. A performance that terrified the devout young scholar. But, being a favorite...
How about that? So we've seen Ibn Battuta has seen different ways of practicing Islam throughout the Islamic world, but now he's bumped into a lot of different religions, right? He saw some of the local religions in East Africa. He's met with Orthodox Christians, of course, Judaism throughout the Middle East, in Anatolia specifically, Buddhism, a lot of different religions he's been bumping up against now.
Was a financial problem. Keeping up with the Sultan's lifestyle, the extravagant hunting trips, the constant gift-giving, and hosting officials at his house actually put Ibn Battuta into debt. So that was problem number 1. Problem number 2 was that the Sultan was a psychopath.
Oh.
Even Ibn Battuta, who
That's a problem. I will say, on the money issue, this was the thing. In a lot of countries, Middle Ages into the sort of early modern period, where you have these aristocratic officials, right? A lot of these positions throughout the government are filled essentially with landed gentry. Now, yeah, they're making a lot of money, but a lot of things are on their dime, right? They're paying for a lot of expenses, running their office, throwing lavish parties, having people over. And so, you essentially, in a lot of these positions, needed to be a very wealthy landed aristocrat because you needed to be able to pay for all the expenses that came with your position, right?
Often flattered his patrons, wrote, "The Sultan was far too free in shedding blood. He used to punish small faults and great without respect of persons, whether they men of learning or piety or noble descent. Every day there are brought to the audience hall hundreds of people, chained, pinioned, and fettered, and they are executed, tortured, or beaten.
Damn.
Muhammad Tughlaq killed advisors for disagreeing with them. He tortured holy men who refused to come to the palace. Particularly, he liked dropping red-hot squares of metal on victims' chests
Ooh.
and ripping them off. And if he really hated someone, he'd throw them to his trained execution elephants, who would
Execution elephants? Come on, man.
use the swords affixed to their tusks.
Jesus. They mentioned how he'd have religious debates at his palace. I could imagine if you're sort of a Buddhist brought in to have a religious debate with the Sultan, you sort of listen and go, yeah, oh yeah, you're so right. I would not be comfortable disagreeing with this guy.
To play catch with the unfortunate victim.
Ugh.
And perhaps that's when it hit Ibn Battuta. Coming here was a terrible idea.
Yeah.
He began plotting his escape.
Wow. Well, there's been lots of promises of wealth, and initially that seemed to be the case, but he's clearly encountering some serious issues now. Looks like next time we'll get to see China. Hey, talk about far afield. That will be, I think, by far the furthest afield we've seen him go.
1340, Delhi. For 6 years, Ibn Battuta has served as a Qadi for the Sultan of Delhi. But now he's under house arrest, awaiting execution.
What?
His friendship with a Sufi mystic had put him on the wrong side of the court.
Uh-oh.
Ibn Battuta's friend had offended the Sultan by refusing a royal summons and calling the ruler a tyrant. In response, the Sultan tortured the mystic to death and arrested all of his associates.
Yeah, we saw that the Sultan of Delhi would have different religious leaders over to discuss philosophy and religion and spirituality, but that he was also quite a tyrant, and he did a lot of murdering and torturing, meted out a lot of cruel and unusual punishment for extremely minor crimes, essentially just doing something that he didn't like, right? So this is not really a free and open environment. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
For 9 days, Ibn Battuta prays and recites the Quran from memory. Then the Sultan beckons. Ibn Battuta goes expecting to die.
Ooh.
But then the Sultan behaves like they're old friends, and everything's normal, as if he hasn't spent days preparing for death.
Well, how about that? I mean, look, the Sultan, he does seem to be quite a violent, tyrannical individual, but also quite erratic. Can go from one direction to another very quickly.
Like they're old friends, and everything's normal, as if he hasn't spent days preparing for death. Oh. It's at this point that Ibn Battuta realizes one thing. He's got to escape Delhi.
Yeah. Yeah, he survived this time, but what about next time something happens, right?
Right as Ibn Battuta had arrived in Delhi, India entered a 7-year drought, which in turn caused a famine, which in turn triggered uprisings. Lots of uprisings. In fact, Sultan Muhammad Tughlaq would face 22 rebellions during his last 15 years in power.
Wow.
Hindus revolted against taxes, Indian Muslims rose against the foreign advisors, governors declared independence or hatched assassination plots. And Muhammad Tughlaq's paranoia went into overdrive.
You know, Ibn Battuta found his way to India, hoping for a place where essentially he could make a lot of money doing his work. And that's partially come true, but he hasn't quite found maybe what he was looking for, right? They've been dealing with a lot of rebellions, this tyrannical ruler. Not to say he hasn't seen stuff like that throughout his journeys. He absolutely has seen a lot of upheaval, but it's taken him these years to reach India. Now that he's here, and he's been there for a while, as we saw, he's kind of like, all right, maybe it's time to get going. You know, the traveling, I was having a good time doing that. This is pretty stressful. You know, he's sort of been roped into this situation, serving as a Qadi under, this pretty erratic sultan here. He's like, okay, I am a little bit stuck. I gotta get going.
Ibn Battuta tried to tough it out, but after his brief imprisonment, he decided he had enough.
Right.
And while the contract he'd signed meant he couldn't leave India, there was a loophole. He could go into religious retreat. So Ibn Battuta, court official and rich man, took the only escape hatch he could. He gave up all of his possessions, declared himself an ascetic, and lived in a cave. It was something he'd actually felt called to for years, ever since he first began to encounter Islamic hermits.
Well, there you go. My man said, I gotta get out of here. I'm willing to give up everything. I mean, Ibn Battuta, he was a man of education, a Qadi, a man of great qualification at this point throughout his travels, so it's not like he came from absolutely nothing, but he has reached quite a high status in life. I guess he's willing to sort of forgo all, or at least some of that, to sort of get himself out of there. Plus, he serves as this sort of Islamic judge. He's deeply enmeshed in Islam, research, scholarship. So, it's not incredibly shocking that something like this could be appealing to him.
He'd wondered if that would be his path. Now, he learned to meditate, to live with nothing, fasting for 40 days at a time.
Whoa.
But 5 months later, a summons came from the Sultan. He wanted Ibn Battuta back at court. And Ibn Battuta accepted. Partially because the Sultan killed anyone who refused, and partially because the offer came with a gift of gold, robes, horses, and enslaved people that restored all Ibn Battuta had given up, plus some. However, Ibn Battuta, rich again, went to court with a plan. He would get permission to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, and then just never come back. But the Sultan...
That's not such a bad idea. I mean, look, there were networks between... a lot of places at this point. We've seen Ibn Battuta has traveled quite wide and far, but the principle does still hold that if you get far enough away from a problem, it probably won't follow you. The vast majority of the time. If he can manage to get out of there to Mecca and he just keeps going, they're probably not going to come and find him. As we've seen, Ibn Battuta was actually quite exceptional for traveling as far as he did. So if he can get the hell out of there, yeah, he can probably escape his situation.
Had his own idea. He needed an ambassador to visit the Yuan emperor and deliver an enormous train of gifts. Would Ibn Battuta, famous traveler, want to go to China in style? He did not have to ask twice. But travel was dangerous in the unstable empire. And on the way to the coast, rebels ambushed the train. In the conflict, Ibn Battuta was separated from the diplomatic train, carrying all he owned, and was chased into the country. About to be captured, he was forced to lose his pursuers by ditching his horse and hiding while they followed his previous steed.
Damn.
A few days before, he'd been one of the richest men in Delhi. Now, he was alone in enemy country with only his sword, boots, jewelry, clothes, and will to live.
Oh, man.
Then he promptly ran into rebels who
Yeah, I'm gonna say, I don't think he's gonna hold on to that jewelry very long.
captured him, took said sword and jewels,
Yeah.
and handed him over for execution. But Ibn Battuta still had his clothes, boots, and will to live. So, he negotiated his release by giving his would-be executioners his fine tunic. Free again, he wandered the countryside, evading rebels and living by his wits for a week, with nothing now but his shirt, pants, boots, and still a will to live.
What's he gonna lose next? Come on, man.
Then eventually, starving. He stumbled into a town to beg for food and promptly got robbed for his shirt.
Oh,
But he
God.
wouldn't quit. He still had his pants and his boots, and you know what? Wait, scratch that. At this point, he'd actually lost one boot trying to draw water out of
Oh.
the well. So, yeah.
Now, this is pretty desperate. This is about as low as we've seen him. I mean, he's traveled wide and far. Frankly, usually traveling in style. He's made a lot of high connections, a couple of courts around the Islamic world. He has at various times made quite a lot of money. I mean, look, he was a man who had lived in style several times. He certainly liked that sort of thing. This, it's definitely a new low for Ibn Battuta.
It was at this one booted point when he lost his will to live. But then, a miracle. Amidst this land of Hindu rebels, a Muslim man found him, fed him, and took him upon his back to bring him to safety.
Nice.
And all the while, Ibn Battuta recited the Quran until, exhausted, he passed out. When he awoke, he was in a friendly town and found out that the rest of his diplomatic mission was just 6 miles away, and very surprised to find him alive. And they still had all of his baggage and servants. He was
Wow.
rich again. Rejoining the group, they
Okay, so he never really wasn't rich. He just sort of lost it for a moment in time.
traveled to Calicut, a major port city where they could meet up with Chinese junks.
I mean, look, the thing is, you've got these long-standing, long-spanning trade networks, but, wealth in this era, you can build wealth in a particular place. But if you leave that place behind, it's pretty hard to bring that wealth with you, right? Like I said, it's sort of the same thing you have if you have a problem. You can really leave things behind at this point in time. I mean, Ibn Battuta had a life that he essentially left. He's been going from place to place, right? Same thing with wealth. It's not like you can, just set up a international bank account, bring your money everywhere. Nope, your money is in these physical goods. And you can transport them a certain distance, but, after a certain point, you're going to have to leave it behind if you want to keep traveling, or you're going to have to set up a home base somewhere, right? You're going to have to keep coming back.
These ships, enormous compared to the dhows Ibn Battuta traveled on, were Chinese built, but crewed by Muslims in the India-China trade. He marveled at their 5 decks, and most of all, their large private cabins with their own lavatories.
Wow.
However, for this voyage, Chinese merchants and the other court diplomats had reserved all of those rooms, leaving Ibn Battuta with a smaller, toiletless cabin. That was no big deal, though. Ibn Battuta had learned humility after all. He'd lived in a cave, and just days before, he only had 1 shoe.
Yep.
He wouldn't quibble over a slightly smaller cabin. Wait, what's that? Oh, right, yeah. He threw a fit.
Yep.
How dare they dishonor the Sultan's ambassador by giving him worse accommodations than common merchants and lesser diplomats? Ridiculous. After essentially...
Yeah, we've seen throughout this series, I mean, Ibn Battuta certainly went through his fair share of hardships that he braved. However, he could be a little full of himself at times. He certainly wanted the best accommodations for himself. We have seen this trait of his, along with him being a little judgmental at times. Though, as an Islamic judge, that's not too crazy.
Wanting to speak to their manager, the ship's agent, a Syrian, managed to smooth things over by securing a comparable stateroom on the fleet's second, slightly smaller ship. This mollified the prickly ambassador, and Ibn Battuta loaded all of his possessions and entourage into the second ship. The night before the voyage, he stayed on shore to pray, and suddenly a storm blew up. One bad enough that the 2 vessels had to put to sea, leaving him ashore.
Damn.
Again with nothing but the clothes on his back. As he watched from the shore, the vessel he was supposed to be on wrecked, killing everyone aboard.
Oh.
And the second ship, carrying all that he owned, blew so far out to sea that they decided to continue to China without him. He was stranded and poor again.
Jesus.
And now he'd lost all of the Sultan's splendid gifts for the emperor. So he really didn't want to go back to Delhi and explain his failure to the Sultan's execution elephants. At first, he tried to get a job with another
I know we saw them last time, but execution elephants is just about the craziest thing I've ever heard. And like I said last time, we saw how those execution elephants actually worked. Anyway, I'm kind of surprised they didn't come back for him. I guess maybe Ibn Battuta assumed he was a bigger deal than he actually was. I feel like if he truly was this sort of important figure within the Sultan's court, they would have come back for him, at least if they were interested in maintaining that relationship, but I guess they didn't for whatever reason.
Indian Sultan, even fighting in an amphibious assault to prove himself worthy of employment.
What?
But that didn't work out, and Ibn Battuta instead snuck off with a nebulous plan to just go to China. Fulfill as much of his old mission as possible. In doing so, he of course would take the most out-of-the-way route possible through the Maldive Islands. But the local Muslim authorities there needed a chief judge, and they were plying him with gifts, so, old habits die hard.
Yeah, classic. First of all, this man just keeps going, right? He will travel as far out of the way as possible to get to where he needs or wants to go. Secondly, wherever he shows up, I think partially due to his sort of training as a Qadi, maybe partially due to his personality, I don't know, he seems to find himself flooded with gifts and offers of jobs and honors and such.
He agreed to stay and take the job, under a few conditions. First, he got a ton of treasure, making him rich again. Second, he married into the royal family. And third,
Oh,
he didn't want to walk anywhere. Yeah, he had to be carried on a litter like the
Jesus.
king. They
Talk about fool yourself. Come on, man.
agreed, and he spent 9 months meting out punishments under religious law, doling out floggings for failing to attend mosque, sentencing thieves to have their hands cut off, and, unsuccessfully, trying to convince the island's women to stop going around topless. He married 3 more times, finding that the island's cowrie shell dowries were cheap and divorce simple. Indeed, it was common at this time for merchants to get temporarily married during these short stays. But his high living
Yeah, this man has gotten married just about everywhere he's stayed. He has gone through a lot of marriages.
gained him enemies, and he fled the Maldives with his new fortune, only to tarry on a neighboring island just long enough to get married and divorced twice more.
Huh.
Then at last, he took his replenished treasury and toured Sri Lanka before hiring yet another ship to take him to China. A ship which was attacked by pirates, who once again took everything he owned.
Bro.
You know, I don't think the universe liked Ibn Battuta being rich.
No.
But finally, his luck changed. He then got passage to the court of the Muslim Sultan who ruled the northern tip of Sumatra.
Did he become rich again?
And that little side trip you can hear about over in our Majapahit series, because this
Oh.
guy gets around. When he departed, he at last left behind the Islamic world, the last kingdom he would visit, ruled by a Muslim. He stopped in
Wow.
the kingdom of Champa, current-day Vietnam, and visited a third great kingdom, that of the warrior queen, Udura, that may have been in either the Philippines or Java.
That's a pretty big difference. I guess maybe difficult in locating sources. I don't know. Now, Ibn Battuta, most of his travels have been around the Islamic world, right? He's seen mostly Islamic kingdoms, states, etc., etc. But he's done some traveling in areas that are either more mixed and some areas that are not majority Muslim, like Constantinople, for example. Now he's heading up to China. We'll see if he actually gets there.
Urdura, tall, adorned with gold and jewels, her hair flowing long, gave Ibn Battuta gifts and showed him the powerful fleet she used to battle Chinese forces. Her greatest ambition, she told him, was to lead an expedition to India, so she pumped him for information about his time there. Waving goodbye, she put him on a ship to China. And at long last, he arrived at his objective, the
Wow.
land of the Mongol Yuan emperors, where even beggars wore silk. A place so alien he could barely understand it. And haunting his steps came a new horror, the Black Plague.
Uh-oh. Yeah, I mean, now this is truly the furthest afield we've seen Ibn Battuta. We've said that before, but that's because he keeps getting further and further away from where he started. Absolutely the furthest afield will probably be the most different in terms of culture he's seen, I imagine. Right, like we said, he is now well and truly out of the Islamic world. Now, at the end of all these extra history series, they do an episode where they go over everything they missed throughout the original episodes. I'll have my reaction to that listed in the description down below and pinned in the comments section. That will be a channel members exclusive. So if you want to see that, you can become a YouTube channel member by hitting that join button next to the subscribe button. So with that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
1346, Xuanzhou, China. Ibn Battuta found China a land of wonders, an upside-down place where people used paper instead of coin, and even beggars wore silk.
I'm sure. I mean, we've talked about how this is the furthest afield Ibn Battuta has been from home, right? He is now out of the Islamic world, seeing a totally different culture, way of life, different practices, right? This is going to be quite unfamiliar to him. And of course, China is this very long-standing, very prosperous kingdom. So there's certainly a lot to see, a lot of new things here to see for Ibn Battuta, who has already seen quite a lot through his travels.
China was beautiful, he wrote, but it did not please me.
Oh,
Because while Ibn Battuta had traveled widely, most of the communities he visited were Muslim or Muslim ruled, and he rarely ventured outside that bubble. Where minority religions existed, they were at least other monotheists.
yeah, Ibn Battuta mostly has traveled in kingdoms ruled over by Muslims. Sometimes he's been in areas that have been a little more diverse, but they did tend to be still Islamic states with some Christians and Jews. And he's been to the occasional sort of non-majority Muslim place like Constantinople, but I guess even then, still pretty adjacent to the Muslim world, and still other monotheistic religions, so still stuff that he was pretty familiar and comfortable with. This is definitely, like I said, very far afield from what he's familiar with.
Like Christians or Jews. The Chinese, by contrast, were polytheistic and worshipped what Ibn Battuta considered idols. Confucian scholars were dismissive of Islam, and the population ate pork and cremated their dead. This disturbed me so much.
Right, obviously, I think it's a good thing to travel and see new things, but I suppose if you're an intensely religious person, something like this might make you uncomfortable. Also shows you some of that bond between the sort of big three monotheistic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, who often have fights, both sort of literal and figurative, among each other, but there is often some sort of solidarity between the three, the sort of people of the book, you could call them, where they see some sort of solidarity among themselves when it comes to other sort of polytheistic religions.
He wrote that I stayed indoors most of the time and only went out when necessary.
Wow.
During my stay in China, whenever I saw Muslims, I always felt as though I were meeting my own family and close kinsmen. Perhaps it was time to go home. But when he did so, death followed him.
What the hell? That didn't sound good.
Ibn Battuta didn't have to look far to find other Muslims in Yuan, China. Indeed, for over a century, the Mongol Yuan had kept an open-door policy that invited foreigners to settle and form trading villages.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this last time, right? This is, of course, a non-Muslim ruled state, and, certainly not even close to Muslim majority, but it's not like there's no Muslims there. You've got Muslim traders and travelers, right? So Ibn Battuta isn't totally alone in that, right? It's a very diverse population here, doing a lot of international trade. You'll find all types of different people.
While in these Islamic enclaves, he even ran into other scholars he'd met during his travels.
Huh.
Because as you've probably understood by now, Ibn Battuta was not an explorer. During his travels, he'd made his way along well-known pilgrimage and trade routes. The Mongol conquest and the peace and security that they'd created had fostered an unprecedented network of overland and maritime trade routes.
Yeah, I guess that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it like that. He's not an explorer, he's a traveler. And a traveler who wants to make a lot of money as he goes. He's traveling a lot of fairly well-trod paths. It just happens that he traveled more than anybody else. He's not usually forging new roads ahead. He's taking pretty well-traveled routes.
Few people traveled to the extent that Ibn Battuta
Right.
did, but he was far from the only person to journey from Africa to East Asia. In China, he met Syrians, Egyptians, and even a man who grew up 40 miles from him back in Morocco.
Wow, now how about that? Sort of a hometown friend. Yeah, I guess what sets Ibn Battuta apart is maybe, I don't know if you'd call it curiosity or simply getting distracted, is the amount of side quests that this guy goes on. He's got one route in mind, but he makes so many detours along the way, that's what's really racking up all the miles that he has traveled.
Because you see, the world of the mid-14th century was an interconnected world, one where goods and people could go from one side of Africa and Eurasia to the other. And
yeah, I mean, I've absolutely made this point through the series that, of course, we look around at our world today, and it is more globalized than ever, but that sort of gives some people a misconception that you look back throughout history and you feel like, oh, it wasn't an interconnected or globalized world. But that's not true, right? There were plenty of international trade and travel routes, as we've seen through the experience of Ibn Battuta. Plenty of people traveling through these lands, especially if you had some uniting factor, like religion, for example. You had lots of trade and travel through the Islamic world, even beyond, sort of going through the Silk Road. Lots of trade all the way east from China, say, all the way through the Western world, through these European countries, right? So there's a lot of, communication, travel, trade between these three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, right? It's very interconnected.
that would ultimately destroy this period of peace and interchange.
Yeah.
Because in Central Asia, a terrible disease was emerging. A disease that caused painful buboes on the body, extreme headaches, and delirium. An even more aggressive form, the airborne pneumatic variety, caused victims to cough blood and killed within hours. It was a disease born by fleas. Fleas that lived on rats, an animal that liked to infest ships or stow away on caravans and wagons. In other words, an insect that infested all modes of transport Ibn Battuta had taken on his long road.
Yeah.
When he boarded his ship back to India, he had no idea that he was seeing the last days of Yuan China. Bubonic plague would lead to the dynasty's collapse and sow chaos on the peaceful trade roads of the four Mongol kingdoms.
Yeah, and they're exactly right to tie how interconnected this world was to the spread of the Black Plague, right? Because it's going to decimate essentially all of these lands that we've talked about, some worse than others, but very terrible for all. Of course, you can think it makes its way all the way to Europe, absolutely decimates Europe, decimates a lot of the places we've already seen through this series. So this is one of those times when how interconnected everything is has sort of horrible consequences.
Indeed, Ibn Battuta would begin to see that collapse himself. He retraced his route to India and considered going.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't take long for the consequences to begin to reveal themselves, right? The next couple of years, the Black Death is going to wreak havoc, crashing economies and societies and states just about everywhere you look.
Back to Delhi. But word reached him that the Sultanate was tearing itself apart, and Ibn Battuta was worried that the Sultan would execute him for his failed mission.
Fair.
So he made another plan. A little, what is that thing called? Oh yeah, a side trip
Yep.
to Mecca to make the Hajj one last time.
Classic.
But by
That's how he started, right? All of his travels, his journeys started with him making the Hajj, going to Mecca.
the time he made it to the Arabian Peninsula, the pilgrimage season had ended. He would need to wait a year before it started again. So, rather than just hang out, he took another separate side trip. A side trip, revisiting Persia, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt to see how things had changed in the
How
time he'd
about
been
that? Now he's re-traveling over well-trodden roads he saw years before.
and he was shocked at what he found. The great Ilkhan, the man he'd traveled with, was dead, likely from plague. He'd left an empty throne, several ongoing wars, and his Mongol and Turkish generals were ripping the land apart in a series of succession conflicts.
Yeah.
It was the first dark cloud in what would be a storm of sadness.
I think I mentioned this when we first spotted the Ilkhanate a couple episodes ago, that they talked about how prosperous and stable it was. And I was like, not for much longer. It's got a couple years to go.
He arrived in Damascus to find that the son he'd left behind, with one of his many ex-wives, had died in childhood. And a separate message told him that his father had passed away 15 years before.
Damn.
Saddened, he took a
Imagine that. 15 years before. Your father has passed away 15 years ago. You don't even know about it. Or to put it another way, your dad passes away, you don't find out for 15 whole years. That's crazy. I mean, look, traveling so far afield, I guess you sort of have to accept that you don't know who's going to be there when you get back. Of your friends and family members, you don't know who's going to remain. But that's crazy.
trip to Aleppo. But as he traveled, a great curtain was being pulled across Syria.
Mhm.
The Black Plague descended on the Middle East, chasing him on the road. He fled back to Damascus, but found the oasis city ground to a halt, with 2,000 dying every day and
Jesus.
the populace in terror. As in Europe, the Islamic world believed the disease came from a religious rather than medical source. But while Christian Europe interpreted it as punishment for human sin and greeted the plague with apocalyptic sermons, self-flagellation, and massacres of their Jewish neighbors,
Yeah, it was a real weird time. You know what I mean? And to be honest, it's not incredibly surprising that was the response when you have a plague that kills a third to a half of the population, depending on where you are. You know, keep that in mind. That means of every 3 people you know, you're going to lose one or, one, basically. Or every 4 people, 2. But I'll stick with the every 3 people. Not to get too morbid, but you can imagine every 3 people you know, your friends, your family, everyone you know in your life, you're losing one of those 3, perhaps more. That's extremely traumatic. When that happens to a society, what society can deal with that, really? The society is either going to fall apart or it's going to resort to rather radical measures, which happen to be these apocalyptic predictions, people, believing that they're being punished, things like self-flagellation, a lot of strange religious practices, massacres of, minority and other populations like Jewish minorities, right? So it leads to all of these events just due to the immense death caused by this plague.
Islamic cities looked on it as a manifestation of the divine will. To them, it was an aspect of God's unknowable plan that must simply be endured with humility. Ibn Battuta saw the residents of Damascus fast for 3 days, followed by a packed day of prayer and supplication in the mosque. Afterward, the multi-ethnic populace paraded through the city streets together, holding aloft copies of their holy texts. Muslims carried
Hey,
the
there's that sort of monotheistic solidarity once again. People of the book.
Quran, Christians the Bible, and Jews the Torah, all with tears, imploring their God to stop the suffering. Damascus
Yeah.
would lose more than 30,000 citizens to the disease. Its streets choked with funeral parades, corpses left uncovered due to the city running out of burial shrouds. Ibn Battuta fled to Cairo, passing empty villages and bodies along the road. And when he arrived, he found the great city, with a population of 500,000, deserted by its leaders and losing 24,000 residents each day.
Damn.
Plague would eventually kill 200,000, including most of the army officers, sending the Mamluk Sultanate into decline. But in 1348, the worst year of the plague, Ibn Battuta made it to Mecca and fulfilled his goal of making the Hajj one last time.
Yeah, I guess under these conditions, it might have felt even more important to make that pilgrimage. I mean, maybe for some it shook their faith, but as we've seen in such a religious world, whether we're talking about Islam or Christianity, people tended to interpret these events through a religious worldview, and so it only sort of strengthened their faith, though it could lead it in sort of strange directions. So I guess for Ibn Battuta, sort of more important a time than ever to make that pilgrimage.
It must have made him think of his first pilgrimage, when he left Tangier at the age of 21, freshly graduated and never having left home.
Wow.
Now, he was a 45-year-old man. I was moved by memory.
Hey, you know what? You've done all that traveling, seen everything you've seen, gone to all those places, and you've survived for that long. That's pretty impressive.
Of my homeland, he wrote. Affection for my family and dear friends, who drew me toward my land, which in my opinion was better than any other country. Yet when he arrived home in Tangier, he found his mother had died of plague as well, and days later, he was on the road again. At a loss for what to do, he volunteered as a soldier to defend the Rock of Gibraltar from a Spanish siege,
Wow.
but arrived to find the battle already over. Instead, he toured Muslim Spain.
This man will really do anything. He just shows up, any sort of job. I could be a soldier. I can do anything. This man really making cameos wherever he goes. I think I've already made this comparison. Very sort of Forrest Gump-esque story.
Before returning home. But that was not the end of his journey. The Sultan of Morocco, hearing of his voyages, appointed him ambassador to the Golden Empire of Mali.
Ooh.
Though that's a tale you'll have to hear about over in our Empire of Mali series.
Oh my goodness.
Because this dude went everywhere.
Ibn Battuta now has popped up in, I believe, 2 other extra history series. Like I said, Forrest Gump. This man, if you're talking about the sort of Islamic history of this era, basically wherever you're talking about, this guy's gonna pop up.
And when he returned, the Sultan gave Ibn Battuta a new command, to dictate his story to the third Ibn Juzay, so that there could be a record of all he saw in the Muslim world.
Thank God for that. You know what I mean? I'm glad we have this very important source.
Result was not a perfect book. Ibn Battuta worked from memory, and as a result, got details wrong, misremembered dates, and mixed up some events.
Sure.
Someone, either Ibn Battuta himself or Ibn Juzay, decided to fill in the blanks by copying sections of other travel books, even inventing some.
Yeah, I mean, look, we see this with a lot of these grand explorers over time. Some are frankly more dishonest than others. But when you're dictating or writing from memory, you're going to get a lot of stuff wrong. And either, usually, whoever's writing or whoever's editing or whatever will embellish. That's how a lot of history pre the modern era was done. A lot of embellishment, a lot of made up stories, right? So, I can yap about sources for hours. I've talked a lot about sourcing throughout this channel. We got to be very careful when we're using these primary sources. We need corroboration from other sources. You need to understand who's doing the writing, who they're writing for, what's their audience, why are they writing this, right? But with all that, still a very important source, of course.
Journeys, so the book would be a full compendium of the whole Muslim world. For instance, Ibn Battuta likely never made it out of southern China, nor did he travel far north into Russia as the book claims. And Rob will talk about how we know that in our Lies episode. But despite all these issues, The Travels is an extraordinary document. One that, despite its contradictions, exaggerations, and occasionally confused timelines, gives historians an unprecedented look at the Muslim world of the 14th century and how its trade networks operated. Given that, it's almost anticlimactic to say that when they were originally published, they received little attention.
Damn.
In fact, Ibn Battuta's fellow judges often called him an uneducated liar.
Yep.
We know almost nothing about the rest of his life. Only
Yeah, I mean, you can really blame them? They're reading this book and they're like, yeah, there's no shot he did even half of this. Like, come on, man. You're gonna make all this up? He's like, no, I actually did most of this, not all. It's pretty unbelievable, though.
that he likely settled down as a mid-level Qadi, probably married again if precedent had anything to say about it, and died without fanfare. It's ironic, then, that today, Ibn Battuta's personal fame eclipses any of the rulers and even some of the kingdoms he visited. While few people around the world have heard of the Ilkhanate or Mohammed Tughlaq, Ibn Battuta's life has been the subject of television dramas, movies, and even video games. You can visit Ibn Battuta Mall in Dubai, where the different sections are themed to his journeys. Fly into Tangier, and you'll land in Ibn Battuta
It's the most Dubai thing I've ever heard.
Airport. Eat at Ibn Battuta restaurants, visit an Ibn Battuta festival, and even see an unmarked tomb that's said to be his final resting place. He even has a crater on the moon. I have
wow.
indeed, praise be to God, attained my desire in this world,
I'm sure he would have liked all that.
he wrote, which was to travel through the earth. And I have attained in this respect what no other person has attained to my knowledge. Happy travels, friends. See you next time.
Alrighty. It's the end of their series on Ibn Battuta. They mentioned the Lies episode there at the end, as I talked about in the introduction. If you'd like to see my reaction to that, it'll be linked either in the description or pinned in the comments section. It'll be for channel members exclusively. So you want to watch that? Become a YouTube channel member. You can hit the join button next to the subscribe button. So the end of their series on Ibn Battuta, a great traveler, went on this incredible journey throughout the Islamic world. Of course, there's a lot to be said about him individually. He was certainly an impressive character, though quite prickly at times. But it does seem like, especially if you're considering this more through the history or sort of academically, you could say, the real value from his life and story is that through it, you can really analyze the Islamic world of that era, and especially analyze the connections throughout the Islamic world, the trade routes, communication routes, which are often the same thing, through the Muslim world at this point, which is very, very valuable, right? So his life really gives you a lot of good lessons in the history of that era. So really fascinating stuff. You know, I had heard of Ibn Battuta before this series, but all I knew was the headline, right? This great traveler. Now, I certainly know a lot more. So I enjoyed this one. If you guys did, appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, become a channel member once again. With that, hope you guys are having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.